Hello and welcome to the National D-Day Memorial's Lunchbox Lecture today. I'm John Long, the Director of Education here at the Memorial, and we are very pleased to have you joining in to hear a fascinating talk we'll get to in just a minute. But let me first say a couple of reminders for our upcoming events, and actually not an upcoming event, but an everyday thing. Just a reminder that if you are in the Bedford area, October is a spectacular time to visit. If you haven't been to the memorial in a while, come on by. The leaves are starting to change. Great views, beautiful weather. I don't want to be inside today. I'd rather be outside. But we've got this great facility for our virtual program, so I'm looking forward to this one and have been for some time. Our next one after today, you can put on your calendar 2 weeks from today, November 4th, I believe it is. We will have another of our friends from across the Commonwealth, Jim Treasler, my counterpart with the Virginia War Memorial, will be speaking on the mail system in World War II. If you ever wondered how it worked to get mail, what the censorship protocols were, what it meant to the soldiers and the people at home to get a letter. Jim's going to cover all of that as well on November 4th. And then November 11th, Veterans Day, pleased to announce that we will be back with a live commemoration for Veterans Day. The last year's, of course, was COVIDed out and was virtual, and we are going to have a virtual component this year as well. But here in Bedford, if you are around, please come by. We will have Mitch Yockelson, historian, to speak on a particular D-Day fatality, Major Frederick Kellum of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and then our usual recognition of all veterans present, dedication of our new veterans bricks, and a lot of announcements of some great upcoming initiatives that are going on here at the memorial. So join us for that. Be great to have today's weather for November 11th. Can't guarantee it, but all things considered, we will be back in person for Veterans Day. So join us for that. Now, today's program, though, again, I've been looking forward to this one because it's a topic of particular interest to myself. Here at the National D-Day Memorial, we talk a lot about the 29th Division. Not exclusively. We recognize the other divisions that were involved in the D-Day landings as well. But the 29th, of course, has a lot of hometown connections. We were founded by a 29er, Bob Slaughter. Many 29th Division veterans from World War II were involved in the early years. Once upon a time, if you came up here for a tour, is very likely a World War II veteran of the 29th Division giving you the tour. And so we, of course, pay great tribute to the 29th Division, with here at the memorial with every single tour. But the 29th didn't begin on D-Day by any means. There's a long history that is often overlooked. And to kind of illustrate it, brought in one of the artifacts from our collection. We have, of course, a World War II collection, but a few things from earlier than that have been donated. And so I'll introduce you to Sven here. Sven Pilkar was a native of Denmark, lived in Lynchburg in his adult years, and was in the 29th Division in the First World War, was actually gassed and wounded during one of the battles. And this is his uniform. If you notice the 29th patch there on the shoulder, and the wool helmet that we believe was made in France, kind of tailor-made for him. And so we have that to kind of illustrate. But we're bringing in the expert on the subject. And let me welcome Jimmy Kilbourne, the director of the 116th Infantry Regiment Foundation, the Stonewall Brigade Museum. It is in Verona, Virginia, just on the outskirts of Stanton, right on Interstate 81. If you have never visited, you owe yourself a stop when you're going up 81 to pop in and see Jimmy. And he will be speaking today on the origins of the 29th Division in the First World War, and actually going back well before that, because there are deeper roots to the 29th than we often appreciate. And so let me also say, Jimmy is one of our partners in the Virginia World War II Heritage Alliance, a group of Virginia museums who deal with World War II and get together and collaborate on programming. And so we are very pleased to work with Jimmy and other museums in the Heritage Alliance. But Jimmy, welcome.
Thanks, John.
And I'm going to turn it over to you now to tell us a little bit about this fascinating history that has been overlooked in a lot of the history books.
Yeah, John, it's the American story. If you take the 29th Division and many of the early National Guard divisions like the 29th, it's a big American story. So thanks for having me. Glad to be here, and hope that some folks who are watching or will watch this later gain a larger appreciation maybe of how our reserve component National Guard structure works in the United States and how it evolved over time, and how we get to Bedford with the 29th Division. Like you said, they just didn't start in World War II. It wasn't like on February 3rd, 1941, the government said, we're going to take everybody from Bedford and make them into this company. It was a whole long string of situations and mutations and changing and adapting over the centuries to get to that point. So that's what I'm going to cover. We'll start early. We'll build up to World War I. We'll talk really some about what the division did in World War I, where they were, how they were organized, and how that unit patch came around maybe, and those kinds of things. And then we'll also talk about when did Bedford appear on the radar for the 29th Division, and how did that company get there, and why was it there before World War II started. And maybe if I have a couple minutes at the end, I can show a slide or two about the 29th Division still existing, still operating, and that it's still doing things in its National Guard role. So we'll just skip that. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Questions, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, there's a comment or a Q&A chat feature, whatever it's called, on whatever venue you're watching. Please put those in, and at the end, we'll pass those on to Jimmy.
So here's one of the questions we're going to answer for everybody today: is not just why. We all understand the loss of the community of Bedford on D-Day, but really how. How did it become Bedford? Why was Bedford the unit that suffered the casualties that it did, as opposed to some other unit? That's part of the National Guard story that we'll talk about a little bit today. And so I'm going to use some terms maybe that people haven't heard, or they've heard before, maybe didn't know exactly what they mean. I might say citizen soldier, and that could be anybody in history who has served the country in most any military type capacity. But we're really talking about reserve component soldiers, your National Guardsmen or your Army reservist or Air Guard, Air Reserve, whoever, who works a civilian job mostly through the week and then does his training and might get called up for active duty. We might say things are community-based because of the history of what was the militia and then became the National Guard. Everything is based on your community. And of course, you can see that with the tie to Bedford. Every National Guard unit or Army Reserve unit has a home station. That is a town or a community or location where there is an armory. An armory is an old word from where military arms and equipment were kept and locked up in times of need. And the National Guard had adopted that, trying to tie back to their roots as a place where guardsmen would meet to gather their equipment to go for training. We are talking about the modern National Guard. The modern National Guard is part of the Reserve. It is one of the components of the Reserve. There's the Army Reserve and the National Guard when we talk about the Army system. But originally, these guys were militia members 200 years ago, both organized and unorganized. Sometime up until the Civil War and right after the Civil War, a lot of units picked up the name, and some of the laws in the country changed to call them volunteers, trying to increase their professionalism and organization and structure. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, what we call National Guardsmen today were called volunteers then, as their formal name. I might mention the word mobilization, the process of calling a unit to active duty and sending them away for training, and then deployment overseas to conduct their military job. And I might say something like readiness or preparedness, and that's just the tasks and supplies, equipment, people, and training that you have and have to conduct in order to be prepared or be ready to mobilize and do your job. So let's get started. Again, Bedford, Virginia. What many folks might not understand is that there were 12 other communities in Virginia that provided a National Guard company, that a unit had a home station in that town or county, and they were all over Virginia. Bedford just happened to be the one town that had gotten itself through working through the Adjutant General of Virginia and the governor, had convinced them to station a National Guard company in the town of Bedford. And so that's part of how you get Company A in Bedford. But there were 12 other communities, a total of 13, and all of them suffered casualties on D-Day, with Bedford, of course, being the highest. So where we got to start to get to the Bedford, Virginia, is in 1741, Augusta County, Virginia. At that time, Augusta County was huge. It claimed parts of what is now Pennsylvania, all of West Virginia, most of Kentucky. In fact, Kentucky later, before it became Kentucky, was considered a county of Virginia, way down to the borders of North Carolina and Tennessee, and almost all the way to the Mississippi River. So there was a huge requirement to defend that frontier, and we're talking colonial times. And so in Virginia in 1741, the governor established a regiment of militia in Augusta County. So pretty much from Martinsburg today to Bristol today was the frontier all along the spine of the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that county had to establish this regiment to protect the frontier and the settlers there. Based on the English militia system, which was brought by the colonists in Jamestown in 1607, every man of service age was required to keep weapons in the home and be a member of the militia. And in 1741, Colonel James Patton, who is the, I don't know how many times great-grandfather of George S. Patton, was the first Augusta County lieutenant. And the lieutenant was the person appointed to lead the militia. And so that's when this regiment that we call the 116th today gets its start. You'll see how it comes. You're going to be able to see how we start with the militia on the frontier and get to the 29th Division, 116th Regiment as we walk through this. So some of the things that this regiment participated in, its ancestor units, back in the colonial period, Braddock's defeat under George Washington on the road to Fort Duquesne, and Lord Dunmore's War, which was a war of the colonists and the Indians just prior to the Civil War. This Battle of Point Pleasant, I've got a note about here, occurred in October of 1774, just a few months before Lexington and Concord. So things were hot all over the seaboard of the Atlantic coast. Lots of military activity going on. And also, during the American Revolution, this Augusta County area provided troops that became the 2nd Virginia Regiment of the Continental Line, as well as individual militia companies that fought in North and South Carolina, like the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the Battle of Cowpens, and the ancestor units of this regiment witnessed the surrender of the British at the Siege of Yorktown. After the American Revolution and before the Civil War, lots of states had their different militia units, and there was really no regulation much to them. There was just prior to the Civil War, the federal government had some regulations about uniforms, and there was there were at least 2 different manuals of drill for the manual of arms, of how you'd load your weapon and how you'd shoot and how you'd march and form your troops in Napoleonic tactics. So things were kind of not well organized during this period in terms of a formal reserve component that could be called to active duty. Militiamen might not have uniforms, they might not have weapons. The company commander might have to provide all of that out of his own pocket. But here are some of the things on this slide that I mentioned that the ancestor units of this regiment had done in the history they participated in, the history they made. The Whiskey Rebellion, for example, the Virginia militia was called out with Washington to help suppress that rebellion and get people back to order. The War of 1812, Maryland militia units primarily defended Baltimore, and during that campaign of the British getting to, Fort McHenry, where the national anthem was written, but also Virginia militia units from the Shenandoah Valley participated in those actions and have a battle streamer for that, for example. Also, in the 1840s, Virginia sent a regiment to the Mexican border. The first time that the Virginia National Guard has been to the Mexican border. What their job then was to protect the supply trains, the wagon trains of the Federal Army, which was across the border fighting the Mexicans. Still militia, though, just volunteers gathered together, given uniforms and equipment, a little bit of training, and sent on their way. And so then we come to the American Civil War. The American Civil War for this particular regiment was pretty significant. So there were 5 Virginia militia regiments that were called to duty by the governor in 1861 and gathered together in Charlestown, West Virginia, and placed under the command of General Thomas Jackson, and formed into the 1st Brigade, the 1st Virginia Brigade. And you see the numbers of the regiments there. All those regiments were from the western half of the state, across the Blue Ridge Mountains, as far south as Radford and Pulaski, and as far north as Martinsburg and Winchester, Virginia. Martinsburg, Virginia at the time. And at the Battle of First Manassas, that is where the regiment earned its name, the Stonewall Brigade, and Stonewall Jackson later became known as Stonewall Jackson. But First Manassas is not the only campaign that the regiment participated in during that period. You can see I've got them all listed there, the highlights of the more well-known campaigns of the Civil War. But what's interesting, you might start seeing a unique pattern here. Gettysburg and Appomattox, of course, 2 of the highlights of the American Civil War in terms of military campaigns and winners and losers. So far, we've seen that this regiment saw the British surrender at Yorktown, fought in the War of 1812, participated in Gettysburg, and surrendered at Appomattox. Kind of track that maybe if you can as we go along, and we might wrap that up with a comment about all the campaign participation that this one regiment has. So after the American Civil War in the South, Virginia being a southern state, those states were not allowed to have militia units during the Reconstruction period. The government thought that there was no way they were going to let the South rearm and reorganize military companies of infantrymen or artillerists or cavalrymen. So it wasn't until 1878 that the laws were rescinded forbidding militia in the southern states, and all of the southern states reorganized and renumbered and recreated their regiments and militias. Except this time, they're called volunteers. Virginia volunteers and New Jersey volunteers, or even the Rough Riders, I think, were New York volunteers, for example, under Teddy Roosevelt. New uniforms, new equipment, a new name, a new structure. They adopted what the Army was using at the time for all of that structure, equipment, uniforms. And some of the things that this regiment participated in are listed here. The Spanish-American War, Virginia had 4 regiments at the time. The 1st, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 2nd. The western part of the state that we use for the 116th lineage, or for its genealogy, is again through the 2nd Virginia. If you remember, the 2nd Virginia had also been a Continental Line regiment that I mentioned early in the war, or early during the American Revolution. But we had these 4 regiments, and all of them were mobilized for the Spanish-American War. Only one of them made it to Cuba. It was after the fighting had ended. They were able to stay on as occupation troops for about 6 to 9 months. 1 regiment never left Virginia. 2 made it to Florida, I think, before they were recalled. But you might pay attention to those numbers, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 4th regiment, because we're going to see those again. So this takes us up to about 1916. In 1916, there were a lot of, 1906 and 1916, there were several federal laws that came about that reorganized, again, the volunteers, what we call today's National Guard. The Army had realized, was starting to realize, that the folks who wanted to be citizen soldiers weren't quite ready. They didn't have always the same equipment. They didn't have the same tactics or the same training. They didn't have the logistics to bring those people onto duty and mobilize them and send them somewhere. For example, in the Spanish-American War, the Virginia units were using a weapon called a trapdoor Springfield, which is basically an upgraded Civil War musket, while a lot of the federal troops were using a bolt-action rifle that fired a metallic cartridge called a Krag-Jorgensen rifle. So there were a lot of things that these laws in the early 1900s were trying to correct. And it got its first test in 1916, this new National Guard system. So in 1916, most of us from our history classes might remember Pancho Villa, a Mexican bandito, came across the border in Texas and raided a town and killed some civilians and some soldiers, and America was not happy. This is the time Woodrow Wilson was the president. He was very concerned that there might be war with Mexico, and his Secretary of War had an idea that while John Pershing was across the border with active duty federal troops chasing down Pancho Villa to try to bring him to some kind of justice, they would mobilize the National Guard and place them along the entire border from the ocean in California to the Gulf in Texas. And every state sent some troops to the border in the summer and fall of 1916, and they stayed through to the spring of 1917. Virginia troops didn't come home until February 1917. But all those Virginia regiments went to the border. And what they did was they learned how to dig trenches. They learned how to shoot machine guns. They saw airplanes. They used Model T trucks and Chevrolet trucks and trains to transport troops back and forth. Something totally different than what had been done just 25, 30 years before in the Spanish-American War, where they couldn't even get everybody into the theater to participate in the tactical operations. So this slide introduces now a couple things. Getting into World War I. The mobilization of World War I was huge. Every National Guard unit of every state was mobilized and pulled into federal service and reorganized and rebuilt into a structure that the Army had determined that it would need to fight in France. And the modern Army that we might all recognize with patches on their shoulders of different colors, different regiment numbers, different brigade numbers, different division numbers, all of that began 100% because of World War I. the total reorganization of the entire Army and its National Guard, and the beginning of the United States Army Reserve. Back then it was called the National Army. The country had figured out that there were 3 pools of people that they could take from to build an expeditionary force. 1 were the people who were already in the Army. 2 were the National Guard, who had had some training, had some equipment, had some idea about military life and operations. And then draftees, people just pulled off the street and placed into units that were created from the ground up. That later became what we call today's Army Reserve. So the Army was really well organized. Then the country really had some brilliant planners, I think, historically looking back. And the way the 29th Division gets its number, you know, why weren't they the 10th Division or the 50th Division? Well, the reason that they have the number 29 is because when the National Guard was mobilized, the Army started in New England. Let me back up. The Army and the National Guard had agreed that the Army division numbers would be 1 through 25, and the National Guard division numbers would be 26 through 50. 50 and above would be the draftee divisions. So they began mobilizing all the units in the National Guards of the states, and they started in New England. New England around Massachusetts, as the central state, became the 26th Division. Their nickname is the Yankee Division. The 27th Division was the New York National Guard. The 28th Division was the Pennsylvania National Guard. Those were huge states with large populations and large militia or volunteer National Guard structures. So those states could completely fill the new manning requirement. So when they got to the mid-Atlantic, it took Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia, 3 states worth of National Guard troops, because the population was less dense, to make those same structures that previously 1 or 2 states had made. So that's where we get the number 29. We get the number 116 because in the north, the 26th Division had 4 regiments in it: 101, 102, 103, 104. 27th Division, 105, 106, 107, 108. So if you continue to count through the 27th, 28th, 29th Division, by the time you get to the number 29, the infantry regiments that it would be allowed to have would be called the 113th, the 114th, the 115th, and the 116th. And since we're coming from the north to the south, New Jersey becomes 113, 114, Maryland is 115, and Virginia, those regiments were pushed together and reorganized and formed into one infantry regiment called the 116th. I'm going to go into more detail about the Muse, Argonne, and some other things in the next slide. Let's jump to that. So in 1917, when the National Guard was mobilized, Virginia had 3 regiments, the 1st, 2nd, and the 4th. And all I'm showing you here in this slide, it's busy, is the structure of the regiment in the left column, and then the home station, the community that each one of those companies was assigned to have the armory and recruit the soldiers from for that area. So you can see all of these communities in Virginia. What you don't see is Bedford. At the time, Bedford did not have a National Guard unit. They had some militia companies in the American Revolution. They'd had some Virginia militia that fought during the Civil War, but after that, they did not have a unit at the time. So you can see here all the places from across the state that all the Virginia Guardsmen were pulled from, who were infantrymen, to make up this new 116th Regiment. That occurred at Camp McClellan, Alabama, in the spring of 1917. I mentioned earlier that the regiment had come home from the border of Mexico in the early spring, I think February, March time frame. Well, in April, they were called out again they'd just been home for 2 months and were called up to be drafted into this new army that was being reorganized. They left from Norfolk, Richmond, and Roanoke for the 3 collection points, and they sent them all down to Camp McClellan, Alabama, which had just been created. At that time, the Army divisions were called a square division because they were based on 4 infantry regiments. 2 from New Jersey, 1 from Maryland, 1 from Virginia, the Virginia part being the 116th. They sailed for France in June of 1918, so it took them a year of organizing and training and getting ready, getting equipment prepared. Their division commander had a secret visit to France to observe the trenches in the winter of 17 over 18. Finally, in June of 1918, there were enough ships making the transport back and forth between the continent and America that they were scheduled, got a slot. Took about 4 steamships to get the entire division to France. They landed in France, at Saint-Nazaire, France, in July, and were placed in a French training barracks and trained under the French and some British instructors. And in July, they left their training. They were issued helmets, they were issued gas masks, things that they didn't have for training in America. America sent all that ahead, so as troops came into the country, they got this trench equipment that they would need. And finally, in August of 1918, the entire division began moving to the south. On the Western Front in France, the trenches ran from the coast of, I think, Belgium, to the coast, from the coast north of France and Belgium all the way to the Swiss border, virtually nonstop. Our troops from Virginia, as part of the 29th Division, went to the south. The idea was that the southern trenches weren't as active. That's not where the main fight was. The main fight was in the north because the Germans were bound and determined under all circumstances that they were going to capture Paris, period. And of course, the French and the British were bound and determined that the Germans would never capture Paris. So the fighting in the south along the trenches was not as intense as some of the early campaigns in 1916, 1915, such as the Somme or Passchendaele or some of those other brutal operations. So they entered the trenches in August and September and were conducting trench raids and patrols and company-sized attacks, but not full regimental or not full divisional operations. Part of the reason they went down there is they were one of the divisions that were assigned to this operation that the American Army was trying, called the Bedford Ruse. It was to try to convince the Germans that the American Army was really going to take over the southern sector and punch through and push the Germans back and create a salient that was untenable and cause the northern part of the Western Front to collapse, which was around Verdun at the time. It didn't work, but that's where our division first got bloodied, we say. That's our first World War I casualties, and our first casualties in modern war occurred in August of 1918. And we say the first modern war because this is a war with tanks, planes, machine guns, chemical munitions, things that we sort of understand today are commonplace in warfare. Were brand new then, but 100% modern when you compare to the War of 1890s when we went to Cuba. So after the Bedford Ruse didn't work, the Americans were continually pushed by the British and the French to open another front or to help reduce the Western Front in the north. So the operation of the Muse Argonne offensive was really the first big 100% American-led, with all American units, some French assistance in a few sectors, But that was the first thing that Pershing's staff planned, Pershing's staff led. The Americans were in charge. They were commanding their own divisions. They weren't training with the French anymore. They weren't sharing trenches with the British and the French. Totally on their own as a new American army. And that began on October 8th, which was just a few days ago historically. They marched from Belfort, got on trains, went to Verdun, marched around Verdun to the west side of Verdun, north of Verdun, and crossed the Muse River in front of a place called the Moleville Farm in a village called Consenvoye. You could look it up on the map or read about it in a book and find those places. But that's where the 20th Division with 2 regiments abreast, the 115th and the 116th, crossed the river and immediately began fighting against the German army. The German army in their sector were Austrians, not German natives, but Austrians who were part of the Empire of Germany at the time. They began their operation. They served 21 days in straight combat, running uphill, which the French and the British hadn't seen in years. That as trench lines were taken, they weren't turned back over. The Germans couldn't counterattack. They did not have the capability at the time, for lots of reasons, to retake the ground they'd lost. But the 29th Division was pulled out about October 29th and relieved by the 79th Division, partly due because of their casualties. They had so many casualties. They'd lost about a third of the regiment as far as the 116th was concerned for wounded and killed over those 3 weeks of fighting. And so they just did not have enough personnel and equipment to maintain momentum. So a fresh division was put in, and they'd been noted by Haig and Pershing as having never given ground that they'd captured. And that's where our regiment motto comes from, which is ever forward. So the troops are pulled back. They get to witness the armistice in November, celebrating with everybody. And they were returned to a training area in France where they got issued new equipment. They had soldiers reassigned to them to bring their strength back up, made back to be a complete division again. And then in April of 1919, they got sent to the French port, embarked on the ships that brought them home. And finally, by May of 1919, the 29th Division had returned home. The New Jersey troops went to New Jersey. The Maryland guys debarked in Maryland. And for the Virginians, they debarked in Newport News, where the Victory Arch is. Norfolk, the Victory Arch, which still stands today. It was built to commemorate troops unloading from the ships. At that time, the ship pulled up to the dock, you got off, and you marched through town to get on a train, all in one day. There was no barracks. You didn't turn in equipment then. They shipped the guys from the Norfolk, Newport News area to Camp Lee, Virginia, which is now Fort Lee, Virginia. And that's where they completed their demobilization process. They were given a new uniform to wear home. They were given money to catch a train. And they just sent them all home and said, you're no longer in the Army now. And that's how they demobilized troops back then. All right. Since the Army didn't have a process for taking the National Guard and reassigning them back to their states and recreating the units, the Army just discharged everybody. And it wasn't until 1921 and 22 that the states were led by the National Guard Bureau to recreate their units and start their National Guard again. And here's a list of the 1923 Armory locations after this reorganization again. That shows where all the home station locations were. And this is the first time we see that Bedford has been allocated a National Guard company. And it was called Company A even then, part of the 1st Battalion, which it is still part of the 1st Battalion today. But you can see that in this chart that a community in Virginia might have more than one unit assigned to it. For example, Winchester had the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion, as well as Company I, which was an infantry company. A little note here, look at C Company, 116th. It's the 4th one down on the list. And you'll see that it's stationed in Abington. Back then, a community could petition the National Guard of the state and the governor to have a unit assigned to them. There were a lot of reasons they would do this. This was especially during the 1930s, the Great Depression. It was a big economic impact, job creator, and economic boon to a community to have a National Guard company, because it put young men to work. It gave them a little bit of spending money outside of what they might earn in whatever work they could find as a civilian. So the 1920s and 30s come along. Virginia National Guard is participating in things like national disasters, traditional National Guard role, civilian work strikes, the Dan River strikes of the mills in the 1930s, the Richmond streetcar strikes, for example, earlier in the 1900s, traditional National Guard community support type missions that we might all recognize today were going on in the 1920s and 30s, as well as new equipment, new uniforms, new structure, new training, all according to the Army model. It was during 1940-41 that the Army went from a square division to a triangular division, and each division then would only have 3 regiments. For the 29th Division, it became the 115th from Maryland and the 116th from Virginia, and an additional regiment from Maryland called the 175th. But this chart now shows the armory home station locations of the National Guard companies in the 1940 and 1941, right when they got mobilized. And if you look, of course, Bedford, Company A, 116th. Headquarters Company of 1st Battalion is no longer in Alta Vista. That's been changed to the Headquarters Company of the 2nd Battalion. Just simple things like that. But you might notice in particular that C Company now belongs to Harrisonburg, Virginia. So Abington, Virginia lost its National Guard company. Harrisonburg, Virginia gained a National Guard company during this time period. And some other units maybe shifted their name or moved around a little bit. But here are all the communities that make up the World War II 116th Infantry Regiment. There were also communities in Virginia that made up the 111th Field Artillery Regiment, which was a D-Day lander alongside the 116th. So now we know sort of how we get to Bedford through the maturity over time and the mutation of the National Guard from unorganized militia units on the frontiers to structured by the Army, supported by the Army, directed by the Army to have certain equipment, certain training, to be ready to be mobilized for deployment. So we know the World War II history of the regiment. That's especially in the last 20 years has been a big push to remember the World War II generation. But here are some highlights of the division's service in World War II. Called to active duty in February 1941, which I think is interesting because that's months and months and months before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This was Franklin Roosevelt's year of preparedness training, defense preparedness, that the National Guard of the states and some of the reserve units of the Army were called into duty and began training just all over the country. The 29th Division participated in 2 North Carolina maneuvers. They went to Florida for training. Then they went to England in 1942. And of course, the reason I'm sure most of all of us are participating here today is because we know that the 29th Division, the 116th Regiment leading as an assault regiment, landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And that's where you get all the casualties in this regiment. Bedford, of course, had the highest number. Lynchburg, Campbell County, second highest. Roanoke, I think third. There might be a tie there between those two. Roanoke had 3 companies land on D-Day as one community. Stanton, Virginia lost 6 to 9 people. Harrisonburg, about 6 people. Winchester lost a few. So all those communities that I showed you the list that had made up the regiment in 1941, every one of them lost National Guardsmen, the hometown guys, on D-Day. At that time, the regiment wasn't 100% National Guard pure anymore. Draftees had been used to fill the companies of the regiment to bring them up to the full strength required. And so you also see casualties from heavily in the mid-Atlantic and some from the Midwest of the country, where if you look at all the states that all the casualties are from the regiment on D-Day. By that time, it had become truly an American regiment and not just a Virginia National Guard regiment. And you can see some of the other things they did. They fought across France. They fought into Germany. They liberated a large German city named Jülich. They fought on the outskirts of Aachen, Germany. They captured Joseph Goebbels' castle chateau and celebrated with a Jewish synagogue ceremony or religious ceremony there on his desk. Quite ironic, and I think a great way to commemorate that. And then they served in the Bremen Enclave as an occupation force. Guys with enough points were sent home early, and then the 29th Division came home as a group in 1946, disbanded, and reorganized after the war. Here's just to highlight some things of post-World War II service of the 29th Division. Still, the 116th Infantry Regiment still exists. The 29th Division still exists. Did not get mobilized for Korea, did not get mobilized for Vietnam. Had a lot of Cold War service and training. Did get mobilized for service in Kosovo and Bosnia, mobilized for Sinai peacekeeping duties, and of course, all of our soldiers currently have been to Afghanistan and Iraq, most of them more than 3 or 4 times in the last 20 years. We're just going to skip that slide. And so I showed you at the beginning of this slide show the statue there that's in the pond at the D-Day Memorial. This statue is an authorized copy. It's made on a 1-to-1 scale against a human. The D-Day Memorial statue is a little bit larger because you need to be able to see it from a distance looking across the pond in part. But the 116th Foundation placed this statue at Omaha Beach, trying to link the two together. This is placed immediately in the center of the Vierville Draw between the 2 German bunkers of WN 72, which is the German defensive position right at the mouth of the Vierville Draw. We think it's a fitting tribute to connect the 2 locations. Sort of sums up the legacy of the 29th Division. Certainly the legacy is D-Day for the members of the blue and gray, but their story their history is an American history. So that concludes my slideshow, and I think we got maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and if there's a couple questions, we take those and maybe give out a little more information, maybe. John?
Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. Great history, and the history is still being made. Some portions of the unit will be shipping out, deployed later this month, or next month, excuse me. So keep your eyes on the news about that as well. If you have questions, again, we'll take a few minutes to put those in the comments or the chat, and we'll pass those on to Jimmy. But let me ask you. We've got Sven Pilkar's uniform here in remarkably good shape. Very slim guy. You can tell they didn't eat like we do. But tell us about the patch.
Sure, John. I thanks for bringing that up. I didn't quite cover that like I should. You may have noticed during the slides that the first time the division patch showed up was during the World War I slides. And that is when the Army adopted its symbols that we recognize today. And they got that from the British. The British all had unit symbols on their shoulders, And so the Americans wanted to adopt that. They had it approved by General Pershing overseas that they could begin making insignia, and each unit created their own. And so for the 29th Division, theirs was created while they were training at Camp McClellan. And they wanted something that every soldier would wear, officer and enlisted alike, general and private, top to bottom. And so they came up with this design. This is called a monad. It's a Korean design. It's similar to a yin and yang, and there's a lot of symbology in this patch. First and foremost are the two colors. The division picked its nickname as the Blue and Gray Division, which it still calls itself the Blue and Gray Division. Because as I had mentioned early on, all the units were from states that had fought against each other during the Civil War. The New Jersey troops were, of course, Union troops in the Civil War. The Maryland troops were both Union and Confederate troops. And Virginia, of course, fought for the Confederacy at the time. So they wanted the two colors. They needed an emblem that would show that these states, only 2 generations away from their grandfathers fighting each other, were now working in harmony against a common enemy. So they chose this symbol, Korean symbol of life, because of its perfect halves, harmonious halves in union. It's a perfect circle, and each half is intertwining, working together to make that perfect circle, both blue and gray together on the patch. And that's the story of how the patch was created and its symbology. And according to the 29th Division history book of World War I, it was the first patch officially registered with the Adjutant General of the Army as being accepted as the official patch. The patches that units were wearing in France had been approved by John Pershing in the field, as opposed to being registered with the headquarters in Washington. Still wear that patch today, still the same colors, still the Blue and Gray Division. John?
Excellent. I hope I don't blindside you with this, so I don't know if you prepared an answer for it, but what can you tell us about Earl Gregory?
Oh, interesting. Earl Gregory is a Virginia National Guardsman who was a Medal of Honor winner during World War I. He was a young man from Chase City, had joined the National Guard, was mobilized, went to France. Just a few days after the Muse Argonne offensive began, he executed his actions that were turned into a Medal of Honor award for him. Essentially, he was a mortar man. He was responsible for firing a trench mortar. And during the pushes to take the German trenches, he used his mortar ammunition as hand grenades to take a section of German trench and capture several machine guns and several German soldiers, similar to Alvin York. Not the numbers weren't quite as great as far as guns captured and prisoners taken, but the same type of action, and kept his company from being flanked by the Germans in a small local counterattack that was occurring. So he later returned to Virginia and attended Virginia Tech and graduated, but never served in the military after that.
Great story, and says there's a whole history of Virginia Tech, Corps of Cadets, and their heroism through many wars as well.
Correct.
April here in Bedford has a question. She says, "Great museum that everyone should see, but what is your personal favorite artifact at the museum and why?"
Well, every museum, they got so many great artifacts. We all have our multiple favorites, but it's one display case, and there are 3 or 4 artifacts in it. The display case has everything in it is a D-Day veteran. The bottom of the case is lined with shingle rock from Omaha Beach. The operations map is the background, the original map that shows the boundaries and the lines and the objectives of the 116th Regiment, the 29th Division, is the backdrop of this case. And centerpiece in front is a boot washed up from the shore 40 years later, a gas mask washed up from the ocean 20 years later, somebody's canteen cup. But the centerpiece really is a jacket worn on D-Day by Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Meeks, a Roanoke native, a Virginia National Guardsman who rose from private to lieutenant colonel and was a battalion commander on D-Day. And right next to that jacket, we have a picture taken on June 5th before he got on the ship of him wearing that jacket that's in the display case, provided by his family. We know that is definitely the coat he wore on D-Day, and it's the coat he's wearing in the photograph taken of the D-Day leadership as they embarked on the boat. So that's probably my favorite display, and the favorite piece in it is the D-Day jacket, because it's a super tangible, no questions about it. That's a D-Day vet. And I think that becomes important as, our real human D-Day vets are gone and disappear, and the old soldiers fade away, but their equipment doesn't. And a coat that somebody wore on D-Day can help tie us to those events, I think.
I agree. And one or actually two of my favorite artifacts are, can't see them on the screen, I know, but in a case right down here. And it's Colonel Meeks' boots that he wore.
Right.
On the beach. Buddy asked about going a little forward chronologically in your talk, but Frank Peregory and the Medal of Honor. Sure.
Frank Peregory, another 116th Regiment member who was a young National Guard enlisted man from the Charlottesville area. He had lied about his age to join the National Guard and was a really young, youthful-looking guy, but quite the scrapper. Was a hard charger and motivated individual. He landed on June 6th with K Company, which was the Charlottesville Company. They were in the 3rd Battalion under Colonel Meeks, and part of their job was to clear the coast road and relieve the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. And in their mission to get from Verville to Pointe du Hoc along the coast road on top of the bluff leading out of Verville, the battalion was stopped by Germans, a lot of heavy fire, a tank was blocking a road, and some other things. The Germans had mortars in the road, mined the road, mortars and machine guns firing from the trenches overlooking the battalion, and that was June 8th. His company commander had been killed, some of the soldiers in his platoon had been killed, and Frank took out on his own and said, "I'm going to get them." Found his way into the German trenches on top of the hill just outside of Grandcamp, a small village there on the coast, and defeated the Germans in the trenches, captured 30-some prisoners and a bunch of machine guns and a couple bunkers, blockhouses, all on his own with the bayonet and hand grenades. And that relieved the congested road, and allowed the 3rd Battalion to press on along the coast road. Occurred on June 8th. And we have on display here his Medal of Honor provided by the family to be reserved here, which is another fantastic object. They're highly controlled by the government, that the Medal of Honor is. Where they are and who's got them and how many and so on and so forth is a big deal. So it's a big deal to have one, we think, and to have his from the family with his name inscribed on the back is certainly another highlight artifact in our collection, for sure.
I agree. Buddy asked a follow-up question also about what's the deal with the spelling of his last name?
Oh, well, today we know it as Peregory with an R before the Y at the end of the name. Historically, it's Peregoy, and we theorize that during his enlistment process, being a boy from Virginia, he probably said it with somewhat of a South Side, South Mountain, Virginia accent. So Paraguay may have easily sounded to somebody typing up a paper as Paragory. If you throw a little Southern accent on Paraguay, you kind of get Paragory. But it's been misspelled ever since his enlistment by the Army. But his family didn't spell it that way until this time. We think that's what happened. But anyway, that's when the time period occurred.
Great. Now I understand there's some changes coming for your museum there in Verona. What's up?
Yeah, sure, John. Thanks for asking that, because the museum right now is called the Stonewall Brigade Museum, and it focuses on the history of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which we just kind of finished reviewing with everybody. But for the last 100+ years, that story has been intertwined with the 29th Division. And the 29th Division is really, a Virginia-centric unit. Maryland doesn't have many or any National Guard units left in the 29th Division. And so we want to carry that on. We want to make sure that there is a place that people can come, that's easy to get to, free and open to the public, that has a history discussion of the 29th Division as well. And so we're going to expand our focus to wrap in the 29th Division and change our name to the 29th Division Museum, reflecting that last 100 years of service. And we think it ties in well with a lot of other things going on in Virginia, such as the D-Day Memorial. A lot of folks who visit the memorial probably quickly and clearly recognize or understand the 29th Division, not so much maybe the 116th Regiment. So we think it'll actually be helpful for everyone, if we start talking about the 29th Division as a larger piece, and include the 116th and the 115th and the other regiments and units of the 20th Division in it. We hope, we believe that it's going to be a good move for the future for all of us to tell that bigger story.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that change. I understand signs are already changing.
Yeah, they sure are. Sure are.
And we need to come back and visit again.
Yeah. Let's get you all up here. And anybody who's watching or will watch this in the future, no charge. Knock on the door. Come on in Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5. We'll be glad to host anybody that stops by.
And it is. I certainly recommend a visit. So it's easy to get to on 81, It's I think for a lot of people it defies expectations, because you think, oh, there's a World War II museum, and boy, it really has deep roots and a lot of great artifacts. And I will agree with you on the Paragory medal. Just to stand in front of that is a heart-catching moment.
Right.
Absolutely, stop by, see Jimmy, see the museum if you get a chance. We're about out of time now, so Jimmy, I want to thank you again for participating in our lunchbox lecture, and we hope to see you soon. And for all who've been watching or who will be watching this after the fact, again, thank you, and we hope you will come by the National D-Day Memorial and the upcoming 29th Division Museum in Verona to learn more about the story, because we've really only scratched the surface of the history that's out there. So, Jimmy, thank you very much.
You're welcome, John. Glad to help.
Yep, and thank you all to all who've been viewing.